Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Power and the Passion research launch. I'm assuming everyone can hear me and that sound is good. So I'm going to get going. Before we commence anything today, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I pay my respects to all their elders, past, present, and emerging from these lands, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here and also out in the digital realm. For all of you joining us online, please introduce yourself in the chat, say who you are and where you're from, and also acknowledge the people in the land of the traditional custodians where you're dialing in from. So welcome to The Power and the Passion. I'm Claire Maloney. I'm the founder and director of The Bravery, and we're a co-presenting partner alongside Republic of Everyone with Ben Peacock, who you can also see there on the screen, and Mobium Group. So we're purpose-led businesses working towards a better world for greater outcomes for all people. So what's this research? Simply put, we look deeply at a representative sample of 2,000 Australians and what they're passionate about, where power lies, but also traditional systems and structures that also connect to that power, and the power that brands and organizations and individuals have to make change. So without taking up any more time, let's begin. Hand over to Ben.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask you to tell me, Claire, you can see that on your screen, yes, that presentation? Good. So the power and the passion. The name says a lot, I hope. It's because it tells the story of exactly what we're seeking to discover here. What are Australians passionate about when it comes to social and environmental issues? And then who has the power to create the change that people want to see? To find this out, we ran a research study with Mobium Group where we asked 2,000 people their opinion. Now, if you ever look at your average research study in Australia, you'll see a little funny thing that sits somewhere that says N equals 1,024. And for those who don't know what that means is that 1,024 people were asked the question. And the reason it's that strange number is because that's what's statistically representative of the Australian population. So when we go out, when we went out with this research, we asked 2,000 people, which is significantly more, almost double what you need to be representative, which also, of course, brings down your margins of error. When we asked, we thought the most interesting way to split people, we have asked broadly across city, country, gender, all those things. But in terms of splitting the data, we found generations to be an interesting place to begin because, of course, a lot of conversation goes around that. And it's, I find it personally in my mind's eye a lot easier to envisage a Gen Y/millennial versus a boomer versus a Gen X, which is myself, than to sort of go, you know, people 35 to 39. It's just a bit more ethereal for me. So we thought that that would be an interesting way to do things. And the first question we asked them was, anyone who does any good research, is the open question, where I don't give you anything except a question. And I say, and we say to you, of all the social and environmental challenges or issues within Australia, which is the one you find most concerning? And when you just ask the question in a big open way like that, here's what comes back in a word cloud. Global warming and all the associated terms such as climate change were the number one thing people said was concerning them most. Very closely followed by COVID. And you can see that there's some other large-ish ones there, but really everything else starts to fade into the background. When you think about what's right in the top of people's mind's eye, it's the current situation and the future situation, the big situation. And I think also the choice of words global warming is interesting because, of course, this has been this debate between climate change and global warming over time. But when you looked at the words people use, they were more likely to use global warming than climate change. Hence, its representation that way here. The next question we asked people was, we said, that's great, there's your open question. Now let us give you a list of 20 social and environmental issues, and you tell us how concerned you are about each of these issues. And we give, of course, people level of concern. We say, I'm not concerned, I'm like a little concerned, I'm quite concerned, and I'm extremely concerned. Levels of concern. And when you ask people the most acute level of concern, so extremely concerned, here's what they say. Number one is our oceans, and that's a reasonably broad bucket. It's ocean pollution, it's overfishing, it's the Great Barrier Reef. And 36% of people say they're extremely concerned about that. Number two, climate change, very closely following at 35% extremely concerned. And then plastic waste, again, following quite closely at 33%. And it has been pointed out, there is a correlation, in fact, between plastic waste and our oceans, because of course pollution of the oceans is often plastic waste. There's also, to be fair, correlation between our oceans and climate change when you look at reef bleaching and the like. But that's sustainability, right? Everything's connected. When you then look at all 20 issues and line them up on a bar chart, there's some pretty telling stuff here. Again, this is extremely concerned. So this is only our highest level of concern we're talking about here. And what you'll see is, obviously, we've told you the top three. In at number 4, toxic chemicals, then loss of forest and habitat, then air pollution, which you could argue is a version of climate change to a degree, but it's the more what's in it for me right now, what's the concern to me right now version. And then you go to domestic violence, mental health, children's health, etc. The things that we thought were interesting and telling about this were, first of all, the gap between the top 7 issues is 5% difference. It's very small. So even though there's a hierarchy, it's not a very, the gaps are so small that you could argue these are all a pretty similar level of concern. The other thing that we noted is that the first 6 issues are all environmental, and the next are all about people. They're all social issues. So this is a change over research we've seen in the past over, say, the last 10 years, where you tend to get more of a mix. Environmental issues are definitely starting to dominate people's concerns. When we expand that out now and say, okay, that's the extremely concerned, what about quite concerned, a little bit concerned, kind of those other levels? And things are reasonably similar, but they do change a little. Plastic waste comes to number 1. Toxic chemicals comes to number 2. Our oceans drops to number 3. Loss of forest and habitat and air pollution, domestic violence don't actually move. So you see, and then when again you look at the numbers, 83, 83, 82, 82, 82, you could argue those are really about the same level of concern. So in the broadest terms, it doesn't really change much, except to say that the level of concern is extremely high. When you're looking at 82%, 83% of people being concerned about everything down to mental health, which is our top 9 issues, are all over 80%. That's a big deal in terms of how concerned we are about the future. The other thing to note, of course, is how climate change drops significantly from being so you've got a lot of people in the extremely concerned, but when you look concerned generally, it starts to drop away, and you start to look at whether issues such as whether things that are a bit more relevant to me right now start to perhaps come up here. Moving on to generations. Again, there's a lot of consistency, but there are some outliers to draw out. So what you'll note is that oceans, climate change, and plastic waste once again dominate, but they tend to change order a little. The outliers become, for Gen Z, mental health takes a big step up from essentially number 8 in our previous charts through up to number 2 for Gen Z, which is very worrying because it says that they are suffering a lot more mentally, possibly about these and potentially other issues than other generations are. The other thing that you note is for boomers, climate change drops out completely, and it drops out of the top 5 for them. And suddenly toxic chemicals comes up to number 1. So you've got something moving right up through the ranks. So they're the 2 things to call out there. When you start to then look more broadly at level concern across all these 20 issues, you see a pattern forming. Essentially, the younger you are, the higher your level of concern. And literally, Gen Z has an average concern across our 20 issues of 79%, and boomers have 71%, and it literally drops by generation. So the older you are, the less concerned you are. The other thing that's very interesting to note there is that Gen Z, on 16 of those 20 issues, Gen Z has the highest level of concern. And on 17 out of 20, boomers have the lowest level of concern. So really, there is a big split between our oldest and our youngest generations, how they feel about these issues. Unsurprisingly, the less concerned you are about something, the less likely you are to act. The Detail here is not particularly important. What I would just draw your attention to is there are 6 different ways. There are, of course, other ways that you can act on your concerns, but there's just 6 different ways people act. And looking at the generations, the blue dots are the generation most likely to take that action, and the red dots are the generation least likely to take that action. So just looking, you can see that the blues are fairly evenly scattered, though the Gen Z gets 2 blues. Boomers have 3 reds. So again, a lower propensity to act from your boomers, though good on them for being good recyclers. Which leads to the question, if that's what we're passionate about, who has the power to make change on the issues that we as a population care about? But I'll pass you over to Claire to answer that question.
Thanks, Ben. So yeah, power. Powerful word, and you know, a lot of it as well sits within money. So we had a look at where generational wealth sits across our 4 generations as well, and there's just a little bit to unpack here. So Gen Z has just over a quarter, 27% of the net household wealth of a Gen Y, and then a Gen Y has less than half, around 43% of net household wealth in comparison to a Gen X. The average Gen X, they're doing pretty all right. They've got around 75% of the net household wealth of a boomer. And a boomer, well, they're sitting on about approximately 1.3 million in terms of household wealth. So it's not hugely surprising that the longer you live in a capitalist world, the more money you accumulate. To the next slide, yeah. Then what we also then had a look at business as well. So what about power in business? So of the top 50 companies in Australia, 0, that's a big O, as you can see me through my virtual background, 0 are from Gen Y or Gen Z, and 29 CEOs are boomers or older, and 21 are from Gen X. And then we've also got the bosses' bosses. So, you know, who's running these CEOs? Well, in the top 200 Australian companies, 21% of all board members are aged 55 and over. And this is a real moment of pause to consider that strategically and operationally within companies, if decisions are all being made as well within older generations, then that's also going to be reflecting the values that they'll be bringing to those generations as well. And then what about gender? Very staggeringly depressing slide. Just 12 of Australian ASX 200 companies are led by women. I believe there was a study done that showed that you were more likely to have a common name of John than you were to be a woman who's running a leading company as a CEO in Australia. And then we also had a look at politics. So there's a little bit to, yes, someone in chat said, same in politics. We're about to get there. So there's a bit to unpack on this slide. So let's start with age. So you can see that the majority of members of government are currently 40 years and older. And in fact, you're more likely to be 60 and older than you are to be 30 to 39 as a current member in our government. Across gender, there's about 40% representation of women. But it's really important to note, so they're doing, I guess, like a little bit better in business, but it's really important to note that a lot of these female representatives in Parliament are neither leaders of their party or front members or members of their executive. And then across into ethnic diversity. So 1 in 4 Australians have a non-European or an Indigenous background. But we can see here that in the Australian government, only 1 in 10 candidates in the last election had that same ethnic representation. And then looking across into disability, well, 18% of Australians said in the last census that they have a disability, but only 1% of candidates from a major party recorded having a disability in the last election. So it does beg the question, who is voting all of these older white able-bodied people into Parliament? So drumroll, unsurprisingly, older people, 40% of enrolled voters in Australia are boomers and also older, 75 years plus. And only 10% of Gen Zs are actually currently enrolled to vote, which is actually an underrepresentation of that group within an Australian society demographic percentage. So if we're also wanting to see some of the different issues that these younger generations are deeply passionate about, we need to see higher enrollment numbers as well coming from those groups. And then, unsurprisingly, political action isn't aligned with our biggest concerns. So when we look at our oceans, 2018, the federal government removed almost 50% of protected areas from our marine parks. And I think most of us as well could also say that a lot more could be being done for the reef. And if there was an award for coming last on climate change, Australia has won it. In 2020, the Climate Change Performance Index ranked Australia's climate change policies 57 out of 57. So you've got Turkey, Bulgaria, Algeria, Kazakhstan, the stands have policies that are ranking more highly and more progressively than ours. And I think this is also a really interesting point to note, because whilst everyone in the world will be affected by climate change, Asia and some of our countries in this region will actually be more strongly adversely affected by climate change than these other countries that are actually doing more progressive policy than we are. And on plastic waste, a huge round of applause. I believe some of the last final pieces of turnover happened in South Australia just this week. So out of all of Australia's states and territories, only one has a law passed banning single-use plastics, which is South Australia. We need to see a lot more action happening there. So will someone do something about all these things? Because if you actually look at some of these different power representations and look generationally at what issues are that we care about, you can actually see that there's a huge disconnect both across business and government to general Australian population views. So there's a number of gaps there that are going to need to be filled.
So who is going to do something about all this? As Claire says, we've got a gap there. People want action and they're not getting it out of their government. Just from a personal point of view, I know that I felt the surge towards action in human sentiment on climate change at least a decade ago, and I felt, the general sentiment is, this is so big, of course the government will do something, and then everyone just expected that. Therefore, I don't need to worry about it too much. I'm not going to worry about it too much. It's just in the future and the government will do something. And that really feels to have changed out there. It's like, all right, government isn't quite doing something like I thought they would, though COVID may have given us a little more trust in that. But so who is going to do something? And suddenly it's become really urgent in people's mind's eyes. And obviously you're seeing that from people's personal efforts in like veganism / plant-based diet going through the roof, more bikes on the road than ever before, by a long way. You're seeing people trying themselves to do something. But the truth is, I think anyone who's ever done the sums and the maths know that our individual efforts are not really going to be enough. It has to be a systemic piece of change. And therefore we're looking for those with more power than ourselves as individuals to do something about it. And we're looking to play our role as humans to support that. And of course, that brings us to brands and the opportunity for brands and companies to do something about this. When you ask people now whether brands should be having a role in this, essentially 80% of people say yes. That's an enormous shift over time. You can see the verbatim or the little things people have said in the report. I won't read this to you now, but I will draw your attention to the red man there, who represents our 1 in 5 who does not think this. And you can see what he's got to say. And it's not a kind way of saying, I don't think brands should be involved. It's quite forceful and it's quite aggressive. And I think that represents in some ways the conversation. Well, of course they should, versus no, 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 no. And what you're seeing is still the volume of the squeaky wheel is quite loud. But this gives me a lot of comfort personally that brands can ignore the squeaky wheel and say, no, this is mainstream, we need to get on with it. Interestingly, this was not a question. We didn't say, should brands be authentic? Of course, people are going to say yes to that. We simply said, why should they be involved? Or why shouldn't they be involved, depending on your point of view? And overwhelmingly, the response that people gave when given this open question was that all around this authenticity piece, people get when a brand or a company is jumping on a bandwagon. They get when they're sort of just being ear-bashed about something. They get when a company looks like it's been forced to do it. They want companies to choose issues and causes that the company genuinely has a connection to. They want them to do it in a humble way. They want to do it in an involving way where it's not just, look at this, we did this, rah, rah. It's, hey, let's all work together and we'll create the space as the brand to do this. And they wanted you to do it with longevity. If you treat this as this year's ad campaign, it's not really, consumers kind of get that you don't change this stuff in an ad campaign. The good news is, so consumers are quite savvy, a lot more savvy than we thought they would be, actually. The good news is, while they're savvy and they've got demands, they're prepared to reward those demands. So you're seeing that 60% of people are now looking for brands, what we're calling good products and brands. So ones that have tried to reduce their environmental impact, ones who have a better social impact by who they're made by, whatever it might be, ones that support a cause. That's a broad bucket we're calling good products. So 60% of people are looking for those at least sometimes. Around half of people have said within the last month they've made a purchase based on that, that being the decisive factor in their purchase. And 20%, 1 in 5 people, are saying they did so in the last week. So it's still got some way to go. In terms of, yes, I think brands should support these things too. I will make the decision based on them, but there's still some pretty high numbers there. You know, when we first started in this game about 14 years ago, that right-hand number was more like 4%. So that's grown 5-fold in that time. And I think you're seeing a bit of a hockey stick curve in that from what we're seeing. The big question, but will they pay for it? Is 60% of people say they'll pay more. 3 in 10 said, no, it's a kicker. If I'm left with 2 products and one's got good attributes and one's doesn't, I'll take the good one. And 1 in 10 says, no, I think it should actually cost less. In terms of how much will people pay? Well, 30% of people, 33% of people will pay around 5%. So not a huge premium. But then when you look at those bottom 3 numbers, that's 25% of people overall who will pay 10% or more in terms of a premium. And I'll come back to this. I'll get you just to remember those numbers for a sec, because I think there's a lot of nuance in there that's not captured when you just look at raw numbers like this. The first nuance is simply this. Those who earn more are looking for these products more often. And if you look at that left-hand graph, it's people who often or always seek out these products. And that's 50% among your higher earners. So in that sense, when you say, okay, 33% of people will only pay up to 5%, that's an average across everyone. I would suspect that when you start to get to these higher earners, they are more likely to fall into the I'll pay more than 5%. And also I think you'll find out there, just again, my viewing's not research, but you've got brands like Patagonia charging $70 for a t-shirt because it's like buy less, buy better being the sort of philosophy. And I think you're seeing that come through. So I think a lot of the brands that are starting to attach this to their core are seeing some seriously high premiums, and that's another skew. So I think some are failing to get any premium and some are really collecting the premiums, and therefore how you adapt this into your brand is very, very important, which is why I'd say those raw numbers are clearly relevant, but you have to think through the nuance of different categories and different types of brands and how they apply. When you look at what we buy, we basically then ask the question, well, what's the last thing you bought? Because it was a good product. And the good news on this was there was absolutely no rhyme or reason to people's answers. It's not like everybody said this category is the category I do it in. They just said it across the board. It was everything from takeaway that wasn't in a plastic container to bananas that were imperfect picks, to home and content insurance that plants a tree, to reusable plastic, beeswax or something, reusable plastic sort of Glad wrap, Australian made, keep cups, just reusable coffee cups, Aussie owned, cruelty free, packaged in recycled plastic. It's the whole gamut. People are looking for this across every product category. So that's what the research told us. What we've just shown you is actually an amalgamation of two papers, that we've put out. There's one which is called the Brand Edition, which is more about that how people want brands to act, and there's more detail in the actual downloadable. The other one is called the Power to the People edition, and it's more about you and your own personal ability to create change in the world. So if you go to the website, powerandthepassion.com.au, you can actually download both. And the front part is the same on each, it's the passion piece, but the second part is different. And so we've given you a bit of a preview of both stories, if you like, there. So what we thought was interesting was we reached out to a couple of our clients and asked them if we were okay with them telling their story as to how they're taking this sort of information and making it work for them in their business. And we've got 2 case studies to run through, Ben & Jerry's and Officeworks, but I'll hand over to Claire to run through the first one, Ben & Jerry's.
Thanks, Ben. And I just want to acknowledge straight up front as well, a huge thank you that the Ben & Jerry's team, I mean, there might be some lurking here on the call, but they were really generous to allow us to take you all through their campaign today. I think one of the real struggles in this space is often going, but like, show me some people doing it and doing it really well and actually having impact. And then, as Ben's also just discussed, you know, it impacting as well, ideally into conversion with the product. And we've got a beautiful case study to take you through here today. So it is a campaign that Ben & Jerry's wanted to tackle around climate action in the lead up to the federal budget announcement last year. So their KPIs, they wanted 10,000 Australians to write to our ministers expressing urgent need to unfudge our future, which is also as well the new pint flavour that they had released as well. And I can just say, having had the pleasure to work on this, it was, but I think they have what they call a Ben 10, which is the 10 kilos that you put on working on Ben & Jerry's. And I can say, yes, the flavour was very delicious. The second KPI as well was to educate Australians on climate. So they wanted them to take action, but then more broadly as well, you know, Ben & Jerry's has always from the very beginning been a mission-based company. And they wanted to teach Australians, particularly in that 18 to 40-year-old demographic, which, as you can see, linking back to the research, this is also one of the key issues that that demographic really cares about. It's also one of the demographics that as that voting block grows, it's really important that we educate them further on climate change so they can make better decisions at the ballot box. So they also didn't just start their campaign out of nowhere. And I think this is a really important strategic component. They wanted to actually dial up the work slowly over a period of time. So many months before the launch, they actually started to roll out different educational content through their website, through their social channels. And again, anything from like longer form copy where you could, you know, really lean into some of the topics there, but also like illustrations and infographics. And then they also as well knew that they needed to create a bit of a channel for change. So they actually teamed up with Phone to Action, which is a American-based company that actually does a lot of work on the Obama campaign and also a number of different political action campaigns with you know, Greenpeace and other large not-for-profits. And essentially, it's a microsite that allows people to really easily send a personalized email or even a phone call or leave a voicemail message. So yeah, they made sure that was all set up and ready to go as well before they went out. Phase 2 was actually then launching and getting people talking about this thing. So they are a very grassroots, particularly in their heritage. Ben & Jerry's was an activist brand, but they were actually very grassroots in their activism when they first started. And that still lives within their DNA as a company. So they like to have a bit of, I guess, like fun with what they do as well. So the first thing we did is develop some stunt pikes for MPs and also media. So that image is a little bit small, but it will show you actually a big one, I think, in some of the coming slides. Oh, there it is. Thank you, Ben. So we basically asked personalized, you know, messages to some of the key politicians that were making decisions on this budget to, you know, make fossil fuels history and, you know, unfudge our future. One of the also really fantastic things about Ben and Jerry's, and if anyone on this call has retail shop fronts, I'm sure you have also considered this, but they are totally unafraid to essentially make the entire frontage of their store a walking billboard. Well, you walk past the billboard, obviously, the store does not have legs. But the people that do have legs were the bicycle billboards that they also rode around Parliament House during sitting week when the budget was being announced. So they basically continued to do the lap as all the different MPs were coming in and signing in and getting into Parliament House. And then also to make sure as well, we had some sort of more like tongue-in-cheek content. We also worked with Kat Sabbath, who's Australia's cake queen. Please now go to your phones and follow her on Instagram. And I apologize in advance for the Cat 10 that you will probably acquire from following her content, but she's amazing. So yeah, next slide. So those are the beautiful stunt pints. And then also in phase 2, they had 2 stages. The first stage was awareness and education, and stage 2 was driving action. So this slide essentially shows you some of the different artwork that they use. They created some social assets, including GIFs, and just really easy to understand. You know, in social, we're talking really quick content. You've got less than a second to grab someone's attention, and you better make it like, you know, simple to understand and really quick for them to do. They also actually trialed podcasts as well for the first time as a brand, and had a lot of conversion success through that platform. They found that people stayed listening as well for longer period of time than some of the other digital channels they'd used in the past, which is interesting. They did further educational blogs, quizzes, Instagram stories, and also flavor imagery. And then in stage 2, this is also just some further assets, but these rolled out across Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter. But the one I really want to call out is the third one, which says, "Dear MPs, make fossil fuels history," signed. If you actually look at the art, this is actually probably one of the more simple tiles to look at. It, you know, doesn't show Parliament House. It, you know, it's very, yeah, just like, it's what we'd probably consider to be quite basic creative. It was the most successful one. So for any marketers on the call, of which I'm sure there are many, I think, you know, there's something to be said there as well about just making it sometimes exactly what it says on the tin and making it very easy and simple to understand. So just next slide. Yeah. So then also they obviously have many stores and retailers that they can activate given the nature of their company. So across 40 Scoop shops around Australia, they had their staff in t-shirts, they had postcards. They also had, which you can see sort of in one of the images, a very large tub that was also collecting the postcards in store, which they then delivered that tub as well to MPs to basically sort of have a bit of a scale and a moment piece. They also had flyers that they distributed with every Ben and Jerry's Uber Eats order, and, you know, close to 2,000 petrol and convenience displays as well. Finally, and this is critical as part of the DNA of Ben and Jerry's, they never do this work alone. In fact, when they're trying to find out which mission and issue that they're going to tackle next, the very first thing that they do before it goes into a marketing brief is they go and talk to partners. So they actually had 2 nonprofit partners for this. They had Climate Council and 350.org. And they worked with them to host a virtual unfudge party, because this was all happening right in COVID, when most cities around Australia were in some form of restricted movement. And that was actually an educational piece as well. Fans joined and they learned more about 350.org and different things that they could do to reduce their own climate footprint, but also the things that they should be asking for their MPs. And this is some of the PR, and I feel very almost like conflicted to present this to you because it's our work, but yeah, 43 million in reach in press coverage. So we had, again, that core 18 to 40 demographic sitting across Concrete Playground, Urban List, a range of different social shares as well across influencers that we went out with. And yeah, also the founders themselves, Ben and Jerry, got involved. They actually joined in on Have You Been Paying Attention, which was a really surprising piece that we got, because they also actually gave the story a bit of air and room to breathe to actually talk about the climate issues that they were trying to tackle in this campaign, which is awesome. Also in results, 31% conversion rate through digital. So again, we've got those awareness channels, education channels, and then conversion channels. Saw 16 million impressions, 59,000 link clicks, and then 29,000 page views, all of which came together to have a 31% conversion rate. And I'm thinking of the Ben and Jerry's team, because when they often talk about this slide, they go, it's maybe the least interesting slide, given that this is a mission and issues campaign, but it's also a slide that people are pretty interested in. So this basically shows that penetration of the product through grocery actually grew and contributed to the highest gains that Ben and Jerry's had seen in the last few years in grocery around major supermarkets and retailers around Australia. The flavour was really good. And also I know a question will probably be, Ben and Jerry's is an ice cream company. Was it dairy? It was actually a fully vegan flavor as well. But the more important thing that we really want to focus on here is the campaign did reach its goal and its KPI of generating over 10,000 signatures, and that was all driven by PR and digital and store efforts. And so that's the Ben and Jerry's story.
So thanks, Claire. So I guess Ben and Jerry's is an interesting one. We always love working with brands like them and Patagonia and the like, because they've been doing this for a very long time, and one can argue, yeah, but that's been baked into their brand for a long time. They've already got permission to do this. And so I find them fascinating case studies, because it shows you how years of practice starts to assemble your approach and all the different touch points they manage to use quite effectively and quite cost effectively, to be honest, to build this in. But then the question always comes up, yeah, well, what about your kind of brands that haven't got that heritage or are not so obvious as a brand in terms of that? And so this is one of our clients, Officeworks, and this is the good work of Ryan Swenson there and his team, where you will note that obviously if you go to Officeworks, one of the major things that people buy from them is paper-based products, which all that paper you probably don't know, but is from sustainable sources. That's the fairly standard thing they do, but that's not necessarily in the mind's eye of the consumer. So looking at that as a potential cause issue is certainly a good space for them. So they've developed this campaign called Restoring Australia, where they partner with Greening Australia. So again, partnership with an NGO, to do something very simple. The amount of, every time you purchase a tree worth of paper products from Officeworks, they work with Greening Australia to plant 2. So there's a little video that explains it, and then we'll look at how this is rolled out through the market. And I don't know why that keeps stopping there, but you get the idea. So we've been working them with a couple of years to take this to market. And of course, this is a big leap for a big company to say, is this going to be one of our key marketing campaigns? So we took it out there across multiple channels last year, multiple digital channels, with creative that looks something like this. Is obviously only 2 pieces. One of the key points you get in the video there, it's not just about the planting of trees, it's about the planting of restoration of native habitat. So we're not talking about lining up pine trees, but talking about restoring degraded land. And then of course the benefit out of that is the animals. And so you hence see creative like this, a koala saying thank you, because that's the ultimate benefit that starts to be created. There's climate benefits too, but it's a very tangible one for Australians, is that Australian native animals are given back a home that they had lost. By going out with this sort of creative in this campaign, some of the results that came back are quite astounding. So you've got uplift versus control, obviously. Uplift being so people who saw versus people who didn't. And what you'll see is people who said that they see Officeworks as a market leader, up 40 to sort of 60 to 70%, depending what you're asking. Leadership, association with quality, prestige, luxurious. I wouldn't have thought paper was luxurious, but hey. You can see that instantly brands in this space are seen as being elevated brands. That's great. That's the brand. What about the sales? Consumer interest in sales. 88% of people saying this appealed to me, got my attention, made me feel positive about Officeworks, aimed at people like me, made me want to find out more. I would talk about this advert with others. You know, normally things that people talk about adverts with others appear in the Super Bowl or get sent around, you know, on Facebook, or you see it on the Gruen transfer. For something that's appealing to the heart and is really not like funny or any of those things, to have an 80 sort of percent rate, I think is pretty impressive, and it shows that that level of interest in the issues we saw earlier is translated to I'm very interested in people actually creating action on this stuff. When you look at the sort of response, of course, the most interesting part of research is never the quant, it's always the qual, you know, it's the words. That's awesome. Thank you. I'll keep buying from Officeworks. That's a great sentiment. I mean, this doesn't have to drive new sales. It can just stop people going off to somewhere else, you know. Look at that first comment in the middle column, in the main column. Pity the government didn't do the same. You know, there it is in a nutshell. Government's not acting. I need brands to. I'm glad someone is, and that's exactly what we found earlier in the presentation. And so on, all positive, almost all positive sentiment. Importantly though, and rightly, there will be people that will question you. And that's the way it should be, because legitimacy, authenticity, important. If you don't have your people going, hang on a second, I'm not sure I believe this, then you're probably not doing it right, to be honest, if you're not got people asking those questions. So this was a great question that came up. Oh, do you plant 2 native trees or 2 pine trees? It's the classic thing. And then you've got Kerry coming in after Doug saying, yeah, basically, we want to know, like, this is for real. And Officeworks is there, and they're ready, and they've predicted these questions, planned it and gone, there it is. And suddenly you've got people going, oh, great. Well, I can trust you. And suddenly your skeptics, your critics become actually your greatest supporters, because they've had their questions answered. In a way, I always see a skeptic as a disillusioned supporter. You know, if you can bring them on side, they're actually quite passionate. That's why they're asking questions, and they're going to be your best supporters. So knowing, first of all, questioning, are you doing this right? And then having the answers to explain that you are, a very important part of this. So that's Officeworks. I guess overall what we tend to see is there's a few things that work really well when brands do this. Number one is keep it simple. You'll see that when you look at corporate sustainability strategies, they're quite all-encompassing. They have a lot going on, and that's very important. But when you take it to a brand level, they're both very simple, these case studies. One is basically tell our politicians we want more renewables under the banner of Unfudge Our Future. It's a very simple thing. It's a petition-based activism campaign. It works on multiple touch points because it's so simple. When you look at Officeworks, it's very simple too. You use 1 tree, we'll plant 2. There's nothing more to it. It's very, very easily done. A second thing I think is very important is that neither of these campaigns is this year's campaign. They've been doing it for quite some time, and it has taken them time to reach the point where they're comfortable, in the case of Officeworks, particularly comfortable marketing it. It's been happening for a number of years. So longevity in the game is really, really important. And I think the other thing that's important about both of them is they're well-chosen issues. They picked issues that are really obvious to why that brand is into that issue. They sort of make sense. And so it's not like the consumer has to make a lot of a leap. And maybe if I can have a fourth thing, 3 is a magic number, but there's a consumer has a role to play in them. And that's really important to us. Whenever brands just go, we did this, it's just good. I'm glad you did that. I'd rather you did that, but you didn't involve me. You've missed the best opportunity here. You know, with Ben and Jerry's, it's about, hey, we'll create the campaign and you come and do it with us, consumer. You're the hero, you're making the change. And even Officeworks, even though the call to action is simply buy this paper, not that one, at least I feel like when I bought that paper, I doubled the amount of wilderness that's out there. So therefore I'm feeling like I'm playing well. It's my impact, not Officeworks' impact. So we're almost done. We'll move to questions. Just tell you two more things. First of all, that's sort of the beginning of the information. We also have information on sector by sector, what people, I'm going to go this slide first actually, it's sector by sector, what people want each sector to support in terms of their causes. And there's some pretty standard ones and there's some outliers across sectors. So we've got food and non-alcoholic beverages, everyday household purchases, clothing and footwear, travel and tourism. You can read as well as I can. So all the 9 major sectors. We can just literally send you one slide just saying, this is your sector, here's what everybody's thinking. But across, if you aggregate all sectors, we can tell you this. Australian made is the thing people are most interested in right now. And it's because it represents 2 things. Number one, they get the idea that we need to look after our own people and jobs at this point in time in the economy. But number 2, it is a proxy for quality. People understand that that you're more likely, probably extremely likely, that something is made with a higher environmental and ethical standard when it's made in Australia. So it's a proxy, almost a catch-all for a lot of those issues. Number 2, and I know this is already in the questions actually, what do people think about supporting climate change? They think supporting renewables, they think it's a really, really good idea. Made with renewables or carbon neutral, very popular with people at the moment. Just in terms of, if you think about that as a space, the 3 levels of climate, doing good for climate, I go 100% renewable, then I go carbon neutral, then I go net zero. In terms of, so 100% renewable is probably the entry point, but it is also the most understood by the consumer because they get it. It sits on my roof, you power with it. I understand it better than carbon neutral. And the third one is 100% recycled packaging. Obviously not particularly relevant to things like banking and some of your categories, but in anybody who's making products, people are really, really interested in whether you've got 100% recycled packaging. So we will leave it there. I'll stop sharing and we will start answering some questions, beginning with Claire though. I'll let Claire do some answering.
Thank you. I think also one of our team members, Emily, she is the mysterious republic of everyone, has actually already been answering some, but I will just quickly go through the question from Rachel around the definition of toxic chemicals. It was specifically in relation to our food and waterways, and I would say there's definitely some interpretation that would have been made there. We know from other work though, which we didn't ask in this research, but from other work that we've done about this space, that typically the common understanding of it is just chemicals that do either harm to me as a person or obviously to our planet. It's a highly contested space. The fact that you've called out the question, I think you're probably quite interested in it, would have a bit of background understanding in it. So it's typically, as well, when looking at toxic chemicals as an issue, we know that firstly, there's probably 3 things that really need to happen within this space. Time, unfortunately, because different chemicals and how they behave in the environment and effects that they're going to have onto people or the planet are sometimes not immediately known. More funding into universities and studies so they can actually look at what the effects are ideally before we introduce something into our environment, and then further and greater government regulation and action across different pieces. I think there's a lot of people on this call that I can see who have been custodians of sustainability for over 20 or even 30 years in this country, and they saw how long it took to get some of the different chemicals out of laundry products alone as just one category. So it's a really interesting space that definitely needs a lot of more work. There was also as well a question around how the people for the survey were recruited and if they were paid. So the group that is not on this call today, unfortunately, is Mobian Group. They're a leading Australian research firm that's been established for over 15 years. They have access into quite a significant database of individuals who are interested and open to do different studies. That's how they actually capture and recruit the participants to ensure that it's a representative sample of Australians, and they are reimbursed for their time. Just scanning through. Ben, is there one that you might like to take? We've covered off the clean energy. Ben, does a single platform exist in Australia that lists current initiatives addressing the issues outlined earlier?
I have answered in the chat actually, but the simple answer is no. What part of our work is this brand work, and part of it's the corporate sustainability work. What we did is went through all the material issues that come up across multiple categories as material issues to companies, i.e. the ones that most matter. And we looked at those and bundled them and thought we cannot go out there with like 30, 40 issues. So we spent ages with Nick Bez and from Mobium to bring them down to 20 that we felt were the right 20, which is why when you see things like oceans, you could have said Great Barrier Reef because it's almost slightly different in the mind's eye of the consumer, but we bundled it in with oceans because, and then you could say toxic chemicals in my waterways versus my food are different things. But so we created that list because there was no list as such, no. Another one, modern slavery, not so much, though. Someone said, we wonder if modern slavery is coming up in research. Not so much under those words. Like, you got to imagine that's coming up a lot as a probably the number 2 issue at a corporate level for corporate sustainability strategies after climate. So it's a big deal. But if you think how the consumer would relate to that issue, it's sweatshops and that sort of thing. It's ethical labor, maybe they'll get, but they get sweatshops. What we have asked that question. We have asked that question is what the causes that a person might want a brand to champion are slightly different to the 20 topics. What are you concerned about? Because you imagine Made in Australia is not a problem, but it's a thing a company might want to, a brand might want to champion. So no sweatshops / ethical labor does come up as a thing a brand could champion, but it doesn't actually come up that high until you get to, of course, retail apparel. Unsurprising, because that's where it's the biggest question. Though I would agree with you, modern slavery is far broader than that and more relevant across a lot of other industries. Another one, just answer a couple of other ones. Do you have to?
How do you make sure? Oh, sorry.
No, you ask. I'll answer. Go.
So how do we make sure that you're not helping companies greenwash?
Yeah.
I mean, we have a perspective on this. Yep.
Well, you go.
So essentially, yeah, let's go. So essentially, there's 2 things that we look at here, and I know it sounds odd to say the first one, but I think it's actually really important to say. The first thing is that whatever they're doing has to be real and accurate, and I think the easy example to point to on this would be Volvo and their emissions scandal. You know, they were actively making a decision to put out information that was fundamentally not what was happening within the company. So I think it's really important that we radically acknowledge that, firstly, you cannot lie, you should not lie, and it's illegal to lie to your consumers and also as well to government regulators. So that's the first part. We have to make sure as well that people that are within those companies can get access to, you know, greater powers and protections as well to call out those issues when they see that, which is obviously not a marketing problem, it's an operational problem, but that's a really important part to acknowledge. The second part though is then how do we make sure it's not just a nice shiny marketing campaign? Well, it needs to be a nice shiny marketing campaign that also has real impact and has real action. And so the only way that you can do that authentically in this space is make sure that firstly, you have a right to be there as a business and a brand. So another really great example I can give to you of this, that's more of a sort of a hypothetical exploration. Just say you are a home cares or laundry product brand. You might want to tackle different issues within the home. So you might decide that the topic and issue that you're going to tackle, if there are anyone from those brands, here's an idea that I'd love to see you tackle, you know, greater distribution of chore share, particularly within heterosexual relationships in the home. So making sure that both men and women are contributing equally in the space. That immediately tells you that as a brand, you might have a right to play in that space because you're actually generating a product and contributing into that issue. So that's the first thing that you have to do. So once you've worked out approximately, you know, where you might be able to play in that space, then you need to go and talk to partners and people and organizations because just a bit for my background is actually not-for-profit in aid and development. And one of the biggest things that you see, or you did see in that sector for a very long time, was huge amounts of duplication of work. So it's not a good use of funds. It's also not a good use of impact. So one of the things that we don't want to see is obviously that slipping into the corporate sector as more businesses and brands start to move into this space. So it's really important that you also acknowledge often you know, decades and decades of hard work that different people have been playing and doing in this sector. And you go to them and you ask them, what do you need and how can we help you? Because essentially, as a brand and a business, what they'll get from you is suddenly a huge amount of reach and network and, you know, possibility on this issue that they've been working so hard on for so long. And I think that's the way forward, to make sure as well that it's not just a nice shiny marketing campaign, but it's a nice shiny marketing campaign that has real impact.
Thanks. Do we have time for one more question? I've been answering a few in the chat. So just noting that Emily is actually reposting a question. So just on the how many people did we survey? 2,000 across 4 generations, 500 each. The greenwash conversation, we could go on forever, but I think that there's been a pretty good conversation with Claire. Enrolling to vote, I just posted something saying the reason younger people don't vote as much is they fall off the electoral roll when they move house. So you're more likely to be enrolled when you're 18 than 23 because you move house and you have to actually go and re-enroll. So that's the reason for that often. Having said that, if you look at the last elections, the young person interest and actually voting has gone through the roof. So they've recognized that they're failing themselves there a little bit. Does every impact initiative made by the private sector need to become a marketing campaign? Absolutely not, Amanda. Most are not. To be honest with you, most are not. One of the first things we advise any brand doing this is you better have a corporate sustainability strategy to use as your launchpad. There's absolutely no point going straight to brand and not really getting your own house in order. Now, when you look at a corporate sustainability strategy, it will generally have, you name it, but somewhere around 12 to 20 material issues that it tackles, and each will have some level of either target or policy attached to it, and in a pathway to reach that over time. So there's an awful lot of stuff that goes on uncommunicated in companies that are serious in this space, or it goes only communicated in the sustainability strategy. Until that is in position, we are not confident in taking it to a brand level. Once you have that, however, the art is to choose, well, which is the most compelling issue there for my consumers of this brand? And how do I take that to market? So Unilever being an interesting example, they're a house of brands. They have one of the world's most comprehensive sustainability strategies in the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. And then each of the brands tries to find its cause from that strategy and take it out there. Sometimes the same as another one. So that is a pretty good working model. And it's almost like, it's a good way to get brands involved because it's a way of tickling the fancy of brand people. We've got this for you. It's a bit of a smorgasbord. Which one do you think your consumers might like? So, yeah. Just looking for other questions. I find brands, so sorry, yeah, no, that's probably a lot of them. The greenwash one just comes up time and time again. So just repeat that. I mean, Claire gave you a great answer. For me, it's, have you got a corporate sustainability strategy? We're actually doing stuff which is, because a corporate sustainability strategy is essentially a pathway to constant improvement. Are you making constant improvement in your business on these issues, particularly the one you're out there championing? Are you in this for the long term? Are you actually creating impact versus just PR? You've got to be creating both, in my experience. And don't think of the PR bit as a dirty word, because the PR bit is the ability to draw more people to the cause with you and create more impact. If you look at your communications, not as, look at me, I'm doing good, but hey, here's a cause we think is important, please join us in changing it. It's a very different form of communications. And that's where things instantly shift over. So, and if you're in the game for the long term, I think I just said that, but I think that's an important one. We should probably wrap up, shouldn't we? Let everyone have 2 minutes to finish their lunch hour.
Just one final comment. Does the concept of shared value come up in this research? No. In the work that we do, absolutely. It's not so much a concept that term that consumers would be aware of, but there are obviously a number of different organizations doing work within this space that the consumers would experience shared value without even ever knowing it. And I think that, yeah, that's something that comes up quite a bit. But with that, we will close. Thank you to everyone.
So thank you for all your kind comments in the feed. That's what I was going to say. Some lovely comments. Thank you.
Yeah. And yes, with nothing further to say. Enjoy the rest of your day. And yeah, please do be in touch with Ben or myself, both of us, you know, to make sure that we can, you know, take on anything else as well that you'd like us to take on, particularly as well if you have ideas of future areas. I know there's a lot of questions about different topics, and this, we have ambitions here that this is the beginning of this work, that we will be able to do more. So yeah, really interested to hear from any of you about ways that that can be expanded and looked at, and we'll see if we can take it on.
Thank you.